started with Lindbergh, went wild with Simpson. Cameras in the courtroom, themselves on trial, as Barry Scheck stares back. He's the guest on this first edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
Do you sometimes wonder what really makes the legal system work or not? I'm Ray Brown, and over the next 16 weeks, we'll take you into corners of the courthouse you may not have seen before. We call the series Due Process, and it seems to us that the natural place to start is with the often uneasy marriage between the courtroom and the camera. I've spent more than 20 years trying cases in the courtroom. For much of that time, Sandra King has been in the courtroom too, but as a reporter. And as of late, Sandy, that's usually meant working with the camera.
That's right, Ray, though I can well remember the days when covering anything in a courtroom meant relying on my notepad and an artist sketch. These days, it's a whole lot easier to tell the story and a whole lot more effective. The audience can see and hear what's actually gone on in court. But among the fallout from the O.J. trial, there's been a new round of second guessing on what really counts. Do cameras somehow get in the way, influence fairness, interfere with justice? The questions are at least as old as an earlier trial right here in New Jersey.
Inside the hotel, the press has established their headquarters. Reporters, cameramen, radio announcers, typewriters, the telegraph, everybody working at top pressure. A madhouse.
This was where it all began, with the circus-style trial of Bruno Hauptmann for the kidnapped murder of the Lindbergh baby. It used to be called the trial of the century, but cameras in the courtroom were never focused more closely or more constantly than they were in the trial that now bears that title.
The jury in the above entitled action find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder.
Still, for New Jersey viewers, the televised trial is nothing new. The camera came to the courthouse in 1981 with the blessing of the state Supreme Court. The result, mass viewing of moments like these.
I shot George Malaban 5 times. It was due to business.
They hit him over and over and over, cracking and crushing his skull.
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty.
Shot in the back. Won't let this man walk. No justice in this world. No.
In fact, the '92 trial of Teaneck cop Gary Spath on charges of reckless manslaughter in the shooting death of young Philip Pinnell was seen by some as a test of the TV trial. Pinnell wasn't the first black kid shot in the back by a white cop's bullet, but he was the first in this Bergen County suburb, and his death touched nerves and touched off angry protests in this uneasily integrated town.
Justice gonna be done!
So despite defense efforts to keep them out, the trial drew national as well as local cameras whose coverage ranged from the official accusation.
All that matters is those hands were in the air, they were away from his body.
To a judge's outrage when this surprise spectator showed up in court.
He had no right to be brought into this courtroom after we started the morning session.
To Spath's own version of what happened that night.
I fired another shot. Why? Because he was going to shoot me.
In the end, though, the verdict was not guilty. Teaneck stayed calm, despite the cameras, or because of them.
I think that the public could better accept the acquittal of the police officer afterwards because they had seen what the evidence was. There were no racial disturbances after that trial took place, whereas there had been a good bit before.
You think perhaps thanks to camera?
I think perhaps.
But the judge still has say on keeping cameras out, and the latest so-called trial of the century may have led some judges to think twice.
In a case which was a high-profile case, I might give some more cause. The thing I would evaluate is what would be the impact of the cameras, still or video, upon the process.
Or on the jury.
They pay particular attention as to how other people treat the proceedings. And if a witness is being treated special, and if that witness is being filmed, that witness is obviously special. They'll pay more attention to that witness.
But does the witness get camera shy?
I think that when you're testifying in court and you're testifying under cross-examination, you were thinking of one person, and that's the person who's bombarding you with those questions. You don't have time to think about what's happening in a lens at the other side of the courtroom.
But does the lawyer feel the impact of the lens?
Yes, in a case like the O.J. trial, it might be a factor, because there the lawyers were playing to a bigger audience.
Better trial without cameras?
It would have been more orderly. It would have been shorter. And obviously not for O.J. I don't think it could be any better. He got a not guilty. But I think it would have been more orderly. It would not have been so much hype, so much hoopla, so much media, and so much entertainment.
And though TV coverage of Mike Critchley's trials have generally been limited to the artist sketch, in a 1993 mob trial, we got the chance to see him in a performance of his own.
They're liars, they're murderers, they're manipulators, they're schemers, and they come out, hey, I'm Philip Unity.
My name is Phil. Whatever it is, I'm maybe selling real estate. Me and my wife, Gina. I used to know her former fiancé, but he's dead. I killed him.
Makes you perform absolutely at the top of your game, because you're not just being watched by a few people in the courtroom. You're being watched by thousands, potentially millions of people, and you cannot make any mistakes.
And the cable network, whose business is court cameras, makes claims beyond what goes on in court to what happens outside when cameras are kept out.
They counteract the kind of circus atmosphere outside the courtroom, where there are talk shows, where there are non-knowledgeable people making commentary. That is the effect of not having a camera in the courtroom.
And though cameras are allowed in court now in 47 states, where they are still off limits is in federal court. There were some experiments allowed in some districts, but they apparently failed to impress. The ban remains in place. But Ray, you know, the true believers among camera in the court proponents insist that even in federal court, it's just a matter of time before the ban comes down and the camera goes in.
You're correct, Sandy, but I think the true believers' timetable is going to be adversely affected by the consequences of the nation's experience with the Simpson trial.
And that's probably just the beginning of what we might call the O.J. effect.
And when we come back, more on cameras in the courtroom with Judge Charles DeGisi, who presided at what may have been New Jersey's most heavily televised trial, and Barry Scheck, who, thanks to cameras, tried the O.J. case with the whole world watching.
I think cameras should be in so people can see exactly what goes on in a courtroom.
It becomes a show, you know, it becomes not that serious.
I think they need to revamp the legal system, which is obvious after the O.J. Simpson, and it wouldn't be done without those cameras.
Simpson trial? It was a joke. It was a circus.
You think the camera did that?
Well, it had a lot to do with it.
Well, after the O.J. Simpson trial, I'm sort of sick of it.
They should have an artist there, which is the routine thing to do, and that's that.
But it's not routine anymore. These days, unless you're in federal court, TV coverage of trials usually means cameras. That's our focus in this first edition of Due Process. Our guests, two men who've been there. Retired Judge Charles DeGisi has probably spent more time in front of the courtroom camera than any other judge in New Jersey. And Barry Scheck may have spent more time in court on camera than any other lawyer in the world. Barry, while you were spending all that time on camera, we know that a lawyer's responsibility is to work as hard for his client regardless of the circumstances. But in what ways was it different being a lawyer with millions of people watching you through the camera's lens?
It was scary.
more than anything else, I think, made everybody very, very nervous, because you worried that the next day you'd take a look at yourself on television or you'd listen to the pundits, and you know, they would criticize you in some fashion or form for things that you really couldn't control, or for what you did if it wasn't good enough, and it was frightening.
Were you doing a critique every evening of your own performance based on the cameras?
Well, at first what I tried to do was stay away from it. I absolutely did not want to watch what I did and hear about it the next day, so I didn't want to read about it, because I'd seen that other lawyers in the case had done, both prosecution and the defense, had done examination of witnesses and then watched it the next day, and no matter how much they tried, it affected them, and they began second-guessing themselves.
So even experienced lawyers who'd been there before, in the sense of being in court a lot, were affected, you think, in some ways just by the stress and the pressure of the camera?
Overwhelmingly in this case, without any question.
Judge DeGisi, you presided over a case that got a tremendous amount of television coverage in New Jersey and around the country, the Spath case. Did you have the sense that the lawyers were affected in terms of putting...
I totally agree with Barry. I think the lawyers, all the participants, even witnesses, are affected by when they know that everything they say, everything they do is being televised. And I think what the obstacle that you have to overcome is to make sure that the task before you is performed, and not to a point of subjecting that task to a minimization of your duty. I mean, really, I think the lawyers are put under a tremendous amount of pressure. I think the judges. I think that everything you say, everything you do is criticized or at least commented upon. And I think that's one of the basic problems, is that you have thousands of experts now telling you what you did wrong. And I think any human being has to be affected by that, and that's what concerns me a great deal about court
I should
TV.
probably mention a fact that you're aware of, which is that I represented the family of the young man who was slain in that case, in the civil matters. But both of you seem to have talked about the criticism, and I suppose all human beings are sensitive to criticism, but when you're in a publicized trial, an awful lot of people are sitting around talking in the evenings, as during your experience. What was your feeling about the critique? Was it unfair criticism, and was it affected by the fact that the critics were watching you all day long on television?
Well, I think the O.J. Simpson case was real different than court television, because you and I have done commentary on court television for quite some time, and you know, in that setting, you're trying very hard to be restrained, to just explain to the audience the meaning of the proceedings. The O.J. Simpson case created an industry of pundits, and I would watch every day, and I would see people get on television that I know did not see the proceedings that we had just gone through, much less have a great deal of insight into it. And they would misstate the facts, and they would come on with all kinds of different criticisms. And even though in many instances you could just reject it out of hand, it still would affect the people in the court, and you knew it was affecting them because you saw it the next day. I mean, I knew when Judge Ito took his hits that the next day he would come back and he would be responding to it in some fashion or form. He would feel compelled to respond to it. Everybody did. And so it had enormous impact.
Well, you could argue that lawyers and judges have accepted this as a consequence, the kind of criticism we're talking about, even if it's unfair.
Yeah, but see, the criticism is not the main factor. I think the main factor is, does it affect the performance? And I'm not talking about a theatrical performance, I'm talking about a professional performance of the judge, of the lawyers, of everyone concerned in this particular case. That's what my concern is, not the fact of criticism, because you're going to be criticized no matter what you do.
Well, if it affects the judges and the lawyers, then what is the impact on jurors as a result of that? Because the jurors, you'd have to argue, are the most important
They may
people.
get a substandard. They may get a substandard performance in relation to professional performance.
Do you think jurors are conscious of the presence of camera or the fact that a trial is being televised and somehow affected in their performance of their duties by the fact alone?
They may be. They know television is there. They know, and you explain to them carefully, that they're not going to televise the jury and so forth and so on. They have to know that. Now, whether they consider the fact that the lawyer or the judge is acting this way because of television is something that the jurors have to tell you. And they may say, well, I don't really put too much strength into that argument by the attorney or by the prosecutor because he's on television or she's on television and so on. I think that may be the case. Well, I don't know.
Well, there's something else that can happen in New Jersey and other jurisdictions, which is that sometimes an entire trial won't be televised, but just some portion of it. If a jury's in the box and the cameras come in, for example, to televise the testimony of one witness, do you think that has a capacity to say to jurors, look, this is a key witness, this is a more important person, or to affect their view of the relative importance of somebody's testimony?
I think that's important. I think that one reform, certainly, if you're going to have cameras in the courtroom, is that there should be an obligation that they stay there for the entire trial, so that the public has access to the footage for the entire trial in case people want to look at it or it arises that an issue, comes up that, on a subsequent occasion where you really want to see previous coverage. I think that's needed.
Now, Judge, you were an assignment judge in Bergen County for, it seemed like 1,000 years.
Well, it was only 11 or 10.
But you were in position to affect the decisions about televising trials. Would you, now, as you think about it, have a rule that a camera had to stay in for the whole trial or not?
Oh, I wouldn't permit. I would never, if I had the discretion, I would never permit a camera to come in to take a portion of a witness or a witness, because in effect, as you say, you're going to tell the jury that the camera is going to be here for Mr. Jones or Mr. Smith, and they're going to say, well, gee, what Mr. Jones or Mr. Smith says must be the very important crux of this case, and it may not be. It may be a selection by the TV or the court TV or whatever network is deciding to do this, but it may not be an important factor. I would never permit a camera to come in to a legal argument where there is no jury. I would have no difficulty, post or pre-trial, but not for a particular witness. I think that's very detrimental to one side or the other.
Jurors are a very sensitive and important part of this process. And one of the things that I'm curious about is whether you have a sense that the knowledge on the part of jurors that there's a camera here brings the community present, so that jurors who in theory decide a case without any reference to the opinions of their neighbors now know that all their neighbors know that this is the case they were involved in and these were the facts, and that somehow they may be more affected by community sentiment in a televised trial because they know everybody's watching. Do you have a sense of that?
Oh, I'm sure that's true. I mean, it's human nature. I mean, everybody feels, because the camera's in the courtroom, that they can make credibility judgments. If it were just covered by the written press, when you read an article, you know, well, that's the judgment of the reporter that was sitting in the courtroom. That may not be my judgment if I saw the witness. I think this is one of the more difficult issues in terms of people that advocate the use of cameras in the courtroom.
Well, I'm sure the question everybody would want to ask you then is, do you think it had any effect on the jury in the Simpson case? The sense that the whole universe or whatever communities jurors felt or were a part of was watching and could evaluate Furman and could evaluate the credibility of all the witnesses in the trial?
Well, in the Simpson case, everybody likes to say, can't be used as an example for anything because the coverage was so intense there, it wouldn't have mattered if the cameras were there or not. The jurors knew everybody was watching. But, I mean, I'm sure it heightened the effect of worrying about what people in the community thought in explaining your verdict later. But I think that this is peculiar to the nature of television, that if people sitting in their homes watching on television, seeing a part of a witness's testimony, feel that they can make a credibility judgment just as though they were in the courtroom, then obviously that's going to put more pressure on jurors, for good or ill.
And is there any effective way to protect against that phenomena? I mean, it's one thing for you at the end of the day to say, don't go home and watch the television set, but it's another for you to say, don't be affected by the fact that you know your neighbors are seeing the same.
I don't think there's any way to protect it against that phenomenon, because the fact is, human nature, and you cannot protect against human nature. You can't protect against how a juror is going to feel, that a neighbor may be saying, oh my goodness, what a silly decision, what a outrageous decision. And hopefully you would say, well, the jurors in any case, even in the Simpson case, probably saw more of a witness in the demeanor, because quite frankly, and this is the one thing that I was very concerned about, we had shots of the celebrities sitting in the audience, and it was off the witness, and the witness was talking sometime. Then we had the families of the victim, and I never understood if there was going to be TV reporting of a trial, why that was particularly necessary,
like
or what Mr. Scheck was doing when Miss Clark was asking a question. They had the camera on his face to get his grimace, shaking his head or twitching or something like that. I couldn't see, and that's what I felt was inappropriate.
Well, do you think there should be controls on what the camera can show while it's televised?
There's absolutely.
One of the most amazing things is that I found out that Court TV, I didn't know this, did not have control over that camera person. And I know at one point threatened, if you do a reaction shot of the family after the jury has shown remains, you know, we're going to fire you. And then some of the other news executives were protesting that. But what was amazing to me is that they would do close-ups of O.J. at counsel table, and everybody could read his lips. And then I'd turn on Geraldo at night, and Geraldo was saying, roll this. And then he'd say, hey, listen what O.J.'s saying. I can read his lips. Everybody can. Or that's what Shapiro's saying, and this and that. And I mean, that was absolutely ridiculous.
That's not the purpose of televising a court trial. Like, televising a court trial is to show the workings of the system. But what they were doing, especially in the O.J. case, was making it a soap opera. There was no question it was a soap opera. And they were, what is Mr. Scheck going to say today? Or what is Johnny Cochran going to wear? Or are they going to be same ties? I mean, I had neighbors, nobody was concerned about the evidence. Nobody was concerned about legal issues. They were all concerned about the reactions of prosecutors and the judge and the defense lawyer. And I think that's what we're missing here. We're not learning the system.
You were going to mention, or it seemed as though you were responding to.
Well, I mean, the judge, you know, pointed. I was thinking about it, that something that's, you know, very insightful, because as a trial lawyer, you know that the jury's watching you all the time.
All the time.
So when I would say something, Marcia and I were big head shakers, and you know, I know if I said something, she would smile or write a note or shake her head, and when she did it, I would shake my head. And frankly, we both knew we were shaking our heads, and we do that every case we try, and I'm not sure that it would be any different if the camera wasn't there, but it was a little disconcerting that everybody was so aware of what you're always doing.
Christopher Darden said it. He says, I know behind me they're now shaking their head on the closing arguments. It was very obvious. And when then the camera took a shot, and you were shaking your head.
Oh, there's no question.
Let me take this away from then the specific context of the O.J. trial and ask whether or not you believe something that I suppose we've all speculated about. At the end of the day, when you turn to a non-sequestered jury and say, go home, don't read the newspapers, and don't watch the television, whether that instruction is as effective with the television, which you can casually walk by, or where your 5-year-old daughter, who might not be reading the paper to you, might say, look, Mom, your trial's on TV. Do you think that instruction is as effective, your ability to control jurors and keep them away from this?
Not if you, the more and more exposure you give to a jury, the less effective that instruction's going to be. You know, you say, don't read a newspaper. Well, they may not. And I always had confidence in a jury. I absolutely did. That I thought they would follow, to a great extent, the judge's instructions. But when you're having exposure in the radio, and there's a bulletin comes in the radio, or there's a little report given, or when you're walking by television, and as you say, the child will say, oh, isn't that your case? And so when you, by normal reaction, you're going to turn. So it's not going to be as effective as if it's on television in relation to the instruction.
The biggest problem is don't discuss the case. I think that's a little tougher when it's televised and everybody's seen the witness, and they can say to the jurors or family and friends of the jurors, I have an opinion that's probably just as good as his juror's opinion because I saw it.
So it's going to make it more likely that somebody in the community who's seen the trial might inadvertently talk to a juror. Okay.
I don't think there's any question. How many people approached Barry Scheck when the trial was in process and wanted to say, well, I saw you do this, why did you do that? It's a fact.
Absolutely.
Now, why aren't they going to approach? Of course, in that case, they couldn't. They were sequestered. But non-sequestered jurors, that's another factor that's going to come in. Somebody comes over for a cup of coffee at night. It's going to be very difficult for them to say, you know, I saw that television and this and this. And you say, oh, no, I'm not supposed to talk about it. I understand that, but, you know, I saw this. Don't you think this is incorrect? They're going to say it.
Let me ask you one other question about the effect on community of televised trials. That is, I think you heard Rob Steinbaum say in the excerpt before we began to talk that he believed that, for example, in the Spath case and perhaps more generally, that the public may have more confidence in the outcome of verdicts after they've seen the trial. Both of you have been in trials where there were public responses before and after. What are your feelings about whether the television camera affects that?
Well, I think that there are a lot of arguments in favor of cameras in the courtroom. This is one of them. That I think that can be true. Frankly, I think that the William Kennedy Smith case may be one of the best examples. The other thing that can be said in this regard is that you do find witnesses. I'll make the best argument I can think for the camera in the Simpson case, and that is, for example, that would we have ever found Kathleen Bell and Natalie Singer? Those are the witnesses that heard Furman make all those racial remarks in casual conversations if they hadn't seen Furman's picture on the television set during the preliminary hearing and remembered, aha, that's the guy.
Right. That's an effect on the proceeding. In terms of the effect on the community, there were significant disturbances in the Teaneck area after Philip Pinnell was shot.
Well,
Steinbaum
there
seems to
wasn't
be...
as many as was predicted.
Okay.
And I think there wasn't as many as predicted is because I believe that the great majority of the citizens in Bergen County felt that the trial, the facts were presented, and a jury verdict was rendered. I honestly do. I think that there were outside agitators that were trying to cause problems with the...
There were comments we heard in the package in which the woman says, well, this doesn't seem like justice. So do you think the young people who'd been in the streets before were the same ones who were watching court TV and watching the trial?
I don't think any of them that were in the streets were watching court TV. That's my feeling.
It's
because the people with the strongest opinions, and even
Judge,
in the
we're running out
OJ
of
case...
time. And it's been a pleasure to have you and Barry with us. And that's it for this first edition of Due Process. But we'll be back next week. Barry Scheck will be back too when we talk about something even newer to the courtroom than the camera, DNA. Till next week for Due Process, I'm Ray Brown.
There must be a witness protection school of personality disorders. Because they all go in with all these problems. They're liars, they're murderers, they're manipulators, they're schemers, and they come out, hey, I'm Phil of Unity.
My name is Phil. Whatever it is, I'm maybe selling real estate. Me and my wife, Gina. I used to know her former fiancé, but he's dead. I killed him. He's gone.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.